Okay. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Okay. My voice might come afterwards because there was a problem with the recording device then. Sorry about that. Anyway, good afternoon on this Sunday, the 4th of January. Happy New Year to you, to all of you. May it be a prosperous New Year for you as well, guys. So, what I've done here this morning, I thought, this is after talking to a lot of you over the holidays, a lot of you, or certainly all of you, and the feedback that I got from when I went around all the tables and the discussions that we had when we were doing lots of professional discussions on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then Thursday with the remainder of the class Thursday. I thought I'd sort of create a PowerPoint to help you structure your reports, to know what to include or what I'm looking for. I did something on the Thursday when there was about 1/3 of the class remaining, and I put it on the interactive whiteboard, and some of the people that attended did photograph it, and I think I've put it up on the group chat that you guys got going there. What I've done is I've taken that, and it's based on what we discussed with regards to that particular lesson on the Thursday. Okay, so that's all I've done really in many respects, is taken that as my blueprint, what I put up on Thursday, not to confuse you, and put it into a PowerPoint presentation. However, just to sort of clarify things, I've updated it slightly since then, because obviously I've had the opportunity to read a lot of work that people have asked me to look at, to have discussions with people online, to have that discussion that we had last Monday on the 30th of December. So with all that feedback and with everything that's going on there, I decided to put this together. Can I just add something though, guys? It's just an aid. It's not definitive. I'm quite happy. I like students to take their own initiative, and I encourage that. There are some tutors who like everything to be very, very systematic, and every student to produce it in a certain way. But I like I prefer the students to come up with their own way of doing things. So this is just an aid memoir rather than a definitive list of what I expect. As long as you cover the criteria, I'm happy how you lay it out, as long as it looks professional and academic. That's the key term, professional and academic. This is just not so much a recommendation, but a suggestion, okay, to help you. Nothing more. So if you've already written it and you're ready and you're good to go, and then you suddenly see this video and you think, oh, damn, I've got to rewrite it. No, you haven't. Okay? No, you haven't. Let me check it, and I'll tell you whether you've got anything missing. But to help you finalize, because obviously you've got probably some drafts there to enable yourselves to check. And, you know, in education, there are two good practices: self-reflection and peer reflection. So get maybe somebody else to have a look at it, and look at it yourself. However, when you do self-reflection, or when you do get one of your peers to look at it, unfortunately, we bring ourselves to the conversation. So, and what I mean by that is we have our own interpretation, which might not be correct. Okay. It's you know, when I became a teacher 25 years ago, you know, no one ever, I found only the experts questioned me on my quantity surveying professionalism, or even the same with law when I got involved with the law. However, as a teacher, everybody's a teacher. So please, this is the reason I've done this report, so that you've got some sort of standardized document, if you like, to base your self-reflection or your peer assessment, one of your peers, upon, so that you can see whether you've included everything. if you don't have time to send it to me, okay, or you don't want me to read it until Friday, okay, so it's just to help with that. It's not a definitive structure. It's not even a recommendation. It's just some suggestions, okay? An aid memoir, I would call it, to help you. All right? So just to remind you, sorry, I'm trying to click and it's not going forward. Just to remind you, this presentation's aim ultimately is to give you an outline of what I expect in the report. And I emphasize the word outline with regards to this presentation, because obviously there's a fine balance with giving you the answer, and there's a fine balance with helping you and giving you some suggestions, okay? And what I'm going to try and do, obviously, is to remind you what the report is. I've used the wrong verb there. It shouldn't be explain. It really should be critically compare, a much higher level verb in terms of learning, so critically compare measurement and estimating methods during the full project life cycle. So forgive me there, because explain is more for pass criteria, and I appreciate that everyone in the group is looking for a distinction or a merit. So critically compare measurement and estimating methods during the project life cycle. That's the sort of aim here, okay? So the first thing that I would suggest is a front sheet with your name, the unit, the assignment, this report, report 1, estimating and quantity surveying would be enough. A little maybe image, just to make it look like I've got there to the left of the presentation, that sort of reflects what you've done. And what that allows it creates a professional presentation, really, and meets academic requirements. No, I'm not going to mark you down, but certainly, if you don't have this stuff, but it just makes life so much easier to mark, because it's written in a nice, structured, logical manner, and then it flows. It just helps, when I was doing my law degree, you had to have a front sheet, you know what I mean, and create your own front sheet that reflected the subject matter that you were dealing with, whether it was employment law, property law, contract law, etc. So we know this is about measurement and estimating. So have a front sheet, have something that reflects the subject, okay? And just set it up like that. That's your first page. Done. Nice, easy, simple. It's not asking much. The amount of sort of presentations, when I say presentations, I mean reports that I've had where they've just gone, no front sheet, no table of contents, and gone straight into it. Introduction. And you're like, introduction to what? There's not even a name on it. It's only because, I know who it is, because obviously I know my students, and generally speaking, HNC classes are around 20 to 30 students, but when you're teaching, say, at a big university, you're going to have 100 students, so you need it, you know what I mean? So when some of you go on maybe to do your a master's or a degree, or your full membership exams, etc., it's just to help you with that as well. And I think as well, if you're doing an apprenticeship, one of the things that you're being assessed on is your behaviours, and it just shows that you're taking this seriously. So you're not just meeting the academic requirements, you're meeting those professional requirements, okay? Table of contents helps improve the structure. You're showing me and the examiners, because it's going to be internally assessed. So someone's going to assess my assessing, the IQA, probably Lucy, and then somebody's going to assess both our decisions. So somebody from outside, from Pearson. And what the table of contents does is it shows us what you're going to write about. Highly professional, academic as well in some respects. Okay, enhances readability. And again, if I take it back, because some of the comments I've got to make, you see, in relation to your apprenticeship, is I've got to make reflection on some of those key principles that you need for the knowledge, skills, and behaviors. So it's not just about knowledge and skills, which you've got in abundance. I can see that, but it's also about behavior. And look, I'm not saying you're a bunch of children. It was a pleasure teaching you all, actually. I spent a glorious 4 days with you, in my opinion. But that's because I teach a lot of level 3 manufacturing apprentices in my sort of day job, if you like. So it was good to be back amongst my kith and kin, if you like. But this just demonstrates to the examiner, an outsider, if you like. I know you're professional, but this just demonstrates that you are professional. But obviously, it's part of any report that you write. So if you were in work and your boss comes to you and says, I want you to write a report on this particular claim that we're making in relation to this subcontractor, then you would put it in a very professional manner, because that claim might go before an adjudicator, it might go before an arbitrator, it may even go to a high court, and the arbitrator, the adjudicator, they expect you to be professional. Okay. Obviously then you've done the first page is a front sheet, second page is your table of contents. Your first heading along that table of contents would be an introduction, and the introduction ultimately is a signpost. This is what I'm going to write about. This is the aim of my report. This is what I'm going to write about. This is what I'm going to include. That's all it is. When I did my degree in law and my master's in law, I was always recommended. Obviously, different subjects have different sort of things. When you're doing an essay in law, certainly, or a dissertation in law, up to about 10% of the final word count. So if you're doing something like between 3,000 and 5,000 words, or 2,500 and 3,000 words, we're talking what, 250 to about 500 words on the introduction. I'm not going to count them. I'm not going to check it, but it would be nice to have a nice signpost. The aim of this report is to critically compare, I'll just say apples and oranges in this case, but I think you know what I mean by that. And this is why I'm doing it. This is how I'm going to do it. And obviously in the process, these are the terms I'm going to work towards. I'm going to define. Yeah. Okay, this is the scope of my report, if you like, all right, and this is why it's relevant. Yeah, so something like that. Okay. When I did, when you do the social sciences, so when you do philosophy or law or something like that, what they actually tell you to do is write your body and your conclusion first, and do the introduction last. And actually, that's a lot of the time, that's what I used to do, because the introduction, because you've done everything, you've drawn your conclusion, and then your introduction, then it flows a little bit better because you know what you've written about, and you've actually internalized it by the end of your essay or your report. Or I didn't do that for my dissertation, but I certainly did it for my for a lot of my law essays. When I did my dissertation for masters, for instance, I kept going back to the introduction to change it, because obviously I kept coming up with different, I'd do a bit of research on something and something else would come up. So the introduction is a fluid thing, is what I'm saying. You know what I mean? You can start off quite loose and then tighten it up as you keep writing the document, which is what I tend to do. Okay. And then probably your second heading, because you want to define some terms, and we want to define what do we mean by project lifecycle, because let's be honest, it's in that particular phrase is in the criteria, so we have to define it. This is how I'm defining it. This is what I'm saying to the examiner, or to me. I'm defining it this way, and what I'm going to use is a recognised industry standard, the RIBA Plan of Works, because I know something about it. You don't have to say that, by the way, but that's why I've suggested that you use it. It's recognised. Royal Institute of British Architects. Okay. The RICS recognise it and recommend that you use it, particularly with regards to creating budgetary controls, etc. and just write a brief overview of what it is and how it's relevant to project lifecycle in this particular case study. All right, I hope that makes sort of sense. Then the third one, sorry, I used white and I shouldn't have because of the background. I might have to change that background. I will sort of go through it. It's NRM1, which is what a lot of what you're going to write about in the report is really about NRM1, because there are a number of different measuring techniques, quantification techniques that enable you to provide a budgetary estimate through the life cycle of the project. And remember, we're critically comparing those quantification methods and the estimating methods that we would use as a result of the methodology that we've applied. And that usually is influenced by where we are at in a particular moment in time, i.e. where we're at during the life cycle of the project. Are we at the beginning? Are we at the middle? Or are we at the end? And let's just take it. NRM1 would be used at the beginning. Okay? Particularly during the design stages of the project. And the design stages basically are from 0 to 4. So 5 of those stages are design stages. And one could argue even 6, 7 and 7 are design stages. I appreciate that. 6 and 7 and 6 and 7 and 5, 6 and 7 are design stages because the design changes during the project and in use. But let's just take it as let's just clarify. Really, the design stages for us in respect to budgets is going to be between 0 and sort of 4 for now. Okay, stages 0 and 4. So those 5 stages, and there are different techniques that we would use based on the information that we have. So NRM1 allows us to create budgets. And if you open NRM1, it'll start with a cost estimate, and it will give you a definitive methodology to quantify and hence produce a budget based on the quantities. And from that budget, then you can use it then to recommend to the client whether the design is feasible or not, or whether you have to adjust the design, or whether you don't even bother because you don't have the money. So, and when I say quantify, you are using a recognized method like gross floor area, functional floor area, okay, functional unit methods, okay. These are all quantifiable methods recommended by the RICS, and there are a number of documents created by the RICS to help you and define what GFA is, what functional floor area is. GFA, I was always taught, is the inside of the external wall from one part of the building to the other side of the building, not taking into consideration anything else. Yeah, that's what I was always taught, and I think that's what's in the RICS documents. Functional floor area will depend upon what the function of the building is. If it's a school, it'll be the classrooms. If it's a shop, it'll be the shop front. It won't be the corridors. It won't be the toilets. It won't be the warehouse at the back of the shop. The storeroom at the back of the shop. It'll be, the function is to sell stuff, so the function will be that shop floor area. And the RICS give you guidance on that and what it means. What the NRM does is it says, look, take a GIFA, gross floor area, then multiply it by a figure that's historic in nature, and you can get that figure from SPONS, you can get it from the BCI database. So you're using historic data as well. So therefore, from that, you are producing that quantification method based on a floor area you can use to estimate a budget. Okay, and it's usually done at the early stages of the life cycle of the project, 0 and 1, when you're carrying out feasibility studies for the client, you know, in relation to the design that they may want. Okay, as you move through those stages and you start to get more drawings, you start to get some clarity on what type of building it's going to be, the materials that you're going to start to use, the types of foundation that you might use. You can then create an elemental cost plan, which is another form of budget, but this time we are quantifying it based upon the GIFR again, or the functional floor area, but we're quantifying it by breaking it down into 13 clear sections. Okay, and we call those sections elements, and we can break it down from the 13 elements that it suggests in NRM1. We can break that down into components, into sub-elements, and components and sub-components, but we need more information for that. Okay, so but for now we can use an elemental cost plan. Okay, as we get more information, we can then start to produce what we call an EUR, which is based on the elemental cost plan. And rather than using just historical data on a building that's very similar to the community centre that we've got, we can start to build up individual rates based again though on historical data, usually in the BCIS or SPONS. Okay, and we call that rate an elemental unit rate. So it'll be a unit rate for maybe the substructure. Okay, so it'll reflect the whole of the substructure and what's required in that substructure. Okay, just as an example. Okay, and once we get more information again, we can quantify it in more detail using approximate quantities. Okay, so we can use an approximate quantities method, or we can again base it on the elemental cost plan, but actually quantify it and then calculate unit rates based upon those quantities, on those very loose quantities, if you like. All right, and that's what you're sort of writing about. You know, you subject it to some analysis, and that will give you the merit sort of grade. Then critically analyze it, and then that will start to bring you up to that distinction sort of grade. Okay, you know, the pluses, the positives, the negatives of each one. Give an example. I'm not expecting an example of approximate quantities because you've just produced a bill of quantities, but maybe an example of maybe a cost estimate, maybe an example of how you produce a cost estimate, maybe an example of an elemental cost plan. Okay, very brief, quite straightforward stuff that you can get off a lot of the information off the internet, to be honest with you. Put it in the appendices, if you like, of your report, and make reference to it. So you've got your NRM1 so if you think introduction is your first heading, project life cycle or RIBA plan of works is your second heading. Okay, sorry, I was sitting back then thinking and reflecting. Third heading then, main heading is NRM1, order of cost estimates, and there may be sub-headings on the different types of cost estimating. You know, your basic cost estimating based on the floor area, your cost estimate, you know, based on the elements of a building, you know, breaking it further down to an EUR, you know, so you've got all these different subheadings then, okay, and a degree of analysis throughout, and maybe some examples as well. You then, you know, that's going to take up the bulk of your work, to be honest with you. There's a lot of detail there. Then you move on to NRM2. You know a lot about NRM2 because you've been practicing it. It's the one standard form of measurement that we've been using. NRM2, much more detailed. You produce a bill of quantities, an accurate bill of quantities, I should say, not actual there. Sorry, wrong word there as well. Approximate or an accurate bill of quantities. What that supports is a tender pricing system of some kind. Whether that tender process is competitive or negotiated in nature, it doesn't matter. You've got this standard document following these standard rules. Yeah? And the quantification method, as I said, it's the same in NRM1. You follow in rules. You know, you can see those rules. And yes, those rules, when you first meet the NRMs 1, 2, and 3 and CESMM, they look complicated, and you wonder, why are we following these rules? But you know, and I wouldn't say all of you, but the majority of you, on the first day that we did some measurement, think about it, you were all panicking. And then by the second and third day, you were all, after a bit of reflection, after a bit of practice, well, actually, this makes sense now to me. I can see after a bit of practice, you know, that I must measure topsoil excavation in meters squared, even though I measure its disposal in meters cubed, because it tells me in NRM2 that's what I'm supposed to do. If I've got DPM that's over 300 mil wide, I've got to measure it in meters squared. However, if it's less than 300 mil wide, I measure it in linear meters. And it's the same with DPC, by the way. All of these things, you're following certain rules. You're laying it out in a certain way based on convention that everybody understands. A dim sheet is a dim sheet. It has a times in, a dimension, a squaring, a description column. The description column is always bigger than the other 3 columns, because you're going to write your descriptions in there. You're also going to do your build-up or rough calculations in the description column. I always add a notes column so that I'm clarifying something for somebody. I made an assumption here. I took away, or I deducted, I subtracted the window openings. Okay, even though I haven't shown it. Okay, so I know it's been done, but you really should show it. Everything needs to be, and I'm going to use an engineering term here, everything needs to be reverse engineered. I've got to be able to reverse engineer your work to see how accurate it actually is and whether you've missed something out. And the only way I can reverse engineer something and check it is to ensure I follow the standards that are laid down by the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, hence NRM 1, 2 and 3, CESMM 1, 2 and 3, which is laid down by the ICE, the Institute of Civil Engineers. I'm following the RIBA Plan of Works, Royal Institute of British Architects, all these professional bodies I'm following a recognised procedure that's been around for at least 100 years. Okay? And it's tried and tested. Remember, I appreciate it's not exact. It's accurate. It's not an exact science. No science is, by the way. If somebody tells you that, they should be locked up. No science is exact. It's just accurate, and it just depends on the degree of accuracy. Okay, so if I was to subject this to some statistical analysis using a normal distribution curve, I'm looking for around, one would argue, 95% confidence. Yeah, okay, depending on obviously my mean, my standard deviation, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so you'd subject this, to some degree of analysis, some would argue. So just to sort of let you know, so that's what you're talking about there. Okay. Obviously NRM3 then is for in use. So once we get to stage 7, it's in use. You're going to carry out some maintenance. You might carry out a small refurbishment. I've got a student at the moment up north carrying out managing a refurbishment, and he's using NRM3 to produce a small bill of quantities, and then from there he can then carry out a budget. So the NRM3 is sort of like more like the NRM2, but it's got elements of NRM1 in it as well. And it allows you for whole life cycle cost management. Okay. And it allows you, as I say, to produce an estimate or a budget in a very accurate, quantifiable, standard way that's checkable. And as you say, this student I've got to check his quantities in the new year. That's for that's not just for it because this, I'm assessing them in the workplace. So this is not just a case study for an assignment. It's an actual mini sort of refurbishment. So he's using the NRM3, which is the correct thing to use, for his building that he manages, because he manages a large building for an insurance company. Okay, and it allows him to budget for whole life cost management. He has to carry out value engineering techniques, so he has to see, okay, they might be expensive at the moment, but if I then compare it to the cheaper option, the cheaper option may have to be replaced 5 times for every once I replace the more expensive option. So therefore, sustainability suggests that I choose the longer term option. But that might not be what the client wants, because it might not be within the client's own budget. But you produce enough information to present to the client. Okay. Operational performance, again, goes back to value engineering. If I have hardwood skirting, it's going to last much longer than softwood skirting, obviously. Okay. Looks nicer, but it is more expensive in the short term. Might be better in the long term though. Okay. Might be better in the long term, because you won't have to replace it as much. Okay, so that's what we mean. NRM3 allows us to carry out those sorts of analysis, and it quantifies things accurately to produce budgets and estimates and small bills of quantities, if you like, or in this case a schedule of rates rather than a bill of quantities that this particular student is producing. I'm just giving you some real life examples there, so you understand the sort of difference between it. Okay, and then I would talk about CESMM, the Civil Engineering Standard Method of Measurement, 3 or 4. 4 is the current one, but people are still using 3. And it's really for the measurement of civil engineering work, so mainly groundworks and below, although it does have obviously some superstructure stuff as well. It uses approximate quants and approximate quants only, because you're dealing with very substantive pieces of work and measurement and quantification. Okay, and it breaks it right down. I mean, it's not just an excavation and a disposal. It will break that excavation right down. I used to teach it in a university in Wales, and it breaks it right down. Standardized again, very similar to NRM, tabular format. You measure something using meters, you measure something using tons, you measure something using meters squared. Follow these rules, include the following in your description. And remember, the description is only telling the estimator what he or she must do when they're producing their analytical estimate. Okay, so the more information you can give the estimator, the more accurate your estimate will be. As you can see when you're asking me a lot of questions about the estimate. With regards to, well, what do I do here? Well, there's not much information, so take an educated guess, which was a deliberate ploy by me, so that you'd all come up with different ways of looking at it. And therefore individualizing each submission. But not just that, some of the problems that you can see when you're actually trying to produce an analytical estimate. So let me just clarify then, again, go back. Introduction, heading 1. Life cycle, heading 2. NRM, 1 with a lot of subheadings, headings 3. Heading 4 will be NRM2, and again, you might have some subheadings there. Heading 5 will be NRM3, and again you could have some subheadings there. Heading 6, CESMM 3 and 4. A brief overview, a little bit why it's a little bit different to the NRM 1, 2 and 3, because it's used for civil engineering works, which predominantly is groundworks, but also can include superstructure for bridges and railways and all that type of infrastructure. Okay. And then the next piece of heading I would add, and this links us now to learning outcome 3 and 4. So those headings that we just looked at there, really, with the exception obviously of the heading 1 and 2, are about learning outcome 1 and learning outcome 2. This one now, analytical estimating, is about learning outcome 3 and 4. Define it. Again, define your phrases, your headings. What do you mean by analytical estimating? There's plenty of information out there, I promise you. Okay? What do you need? Well, it's analytical. We got to analyze the labor required. We got to break it down. That's what analysis means. Break it down into small chunks and put those small chunks back together. That's fundamentally what analytical means. Break down into small chunks. What we are doing though, we're adding a second step to it. We're breaking down those chunks and then we're adding them back together. And what we're doing by analysing, we're breaking it down into 3 particular parts: labour, plant and materials. And for that, we require some standardised time and motion studies, which will give us labour and plant outputs. Yeah, it'll take, I don't know, a bricklayer 1.5 hours to lay 1 metre squared of bricks. Yeah, it'll take, I don't know, 0.9 of an hour for 1 bricklayer to lay 1 metre squared of block, because there's less blocks. Yeah. So you can lay it in a lot faster. But obviously you've got to include, what else do I need though for that? So I've got a bricklayer, but I've also got a labourer. Now bricklaying gangs come in 2 and 1. Well, I've got to break it down because I've got 1 bricklayer, so I'm only going to need half a labourer. Now I can do that one of many ways. I can either sort of give him half the time, so 1.5 hours becomes 0.75 hours, or I give half. You know, I'm paying him £20.70. I'm paying him 20. Sorry, my son's at the door there. I'm paying him £20.70 an hour, and I reduce that by half. There's a number of different ways. I think in my technique is to break down the time and motion study by half. Yeah. So that's my labour rates, the time it takes to produce a metre squared or a metre cubed of a component, and that can either be labour, but it can also be plant as well. Might take 0.25 of an hour for an excavator to dig a metre cubed of soil. Okay, that type of thing. Okay, and it costs a labour, you know, a craftsperson costs, I don't know off the top of my head, £25 an hour. A labourer costs £20 an hour. You know, so why does it cost that? We're breaking it really right down. You know, what materials do we need? How do we quantify those materials? Well, bricks comes in pallets, you know, and you might buy them for 1,000. So when I was buying bricks back in the day, I don't know what they do now, I would say I need 20,000 bricks. So then what I've got to do with those 20,000 bricks, I've got to quantify them into a metre squared. So I know, following precise tables, that if we are laying bricks in stretcher bond, half a brick thick, then it's 58 to 60 bricks per metre squared. So if it's costing me £500 for 1,000 bricks, then 1 brick is going to be 500 divided by 1,000, which is 50p, I think, off the top of my head. And then I just multiply it by 60 for 60 for a metre squared. However, I've got to break it down. Now here comes the difficult bit. How much mortar do I need? So you're analysing things. So I've got to find a measurement or some form of standardised worksheet or template that tells me how much metres cubed there is in a metre squared of mortar for half brick wall laid in stretcher bond, or 1 brick thick wall laid in English bond, or 1 brick thick wall laid in Flemish bond. Because you've got different bonds require different amounts of mortar. So that's what we mean by analyse. We've got to analyse everything now. We've got to analyse the drawings. We've got to analyse the bill of quantities. We've got to analyse the specifications, the preamble in front of the bill of quantities. Do we include them in the preamble bill? Sorry, not the preamble bill. Sorry, the provisional bill, which is a section of the bill of quantities for site overheads, or do we include them in the measured rates bill, part of the build-up rate? These are things you need to decide. How are we going to build it safely? What plant do we require? CDM regulations. If I'm moving materials, I've got to take into consideration things like, I've got to reduce the incidence of injuries and illnesses, so manual handling regulations, do I move the bricks using a wheelbarrow and a labourer? Or do I make it more ergonomic and just hire a telehandler? Do I include the telehandler in my metre squared rate, my build-up rate then, or do I include it in the provisional bill rate? I probably include that in provisional bill, to be honest with you. Same as the hire of a wheelbarrow, and ladders and that kind of thing. So you sort of, what do I need? How do I approach it? And different construction companies will approach it in a different way, and that's why the labour, plant and materials, the build-up rates will change, will be different. Because some of them will use maybe traditional techniques. Others might use modern methods of construction methodology and have a factory that does all of this, and you just assemble it on site. You don't have to actually build it anymore. The factory actually builds it using recognised manufacturing processes that includes maybe robotics. So it's more accurate, it's more standardised, it's better quality, all these arguments that you've got for it, and just deliver it to site. And a couple of labourers, semi-skilled labourers, put it together. It changes everything. But if you're a smaller company, you're probably going to use a much more traditional approach. So that's what we mean by analytical estimating. And that's why the rate can be very different between different contractors, subcontractors, because they will take into things differently, okay? So they are the things that you've got to talk about there. You can also talk about overheads and profit, okay, because you've got to then come up with a percentage figure for overheads and profit and justify it, okay? And again, that's going to change, yeah? Labour rate derivation. How do we get this labour rate? Why did I say 20? It's £24 and something, but let's call it £25. Let's round it up. Why is a craftsperson £25 an hour minimum, and a basic operative is £20.70 an hour? How did you get to that sum? Is it scientific? Well, yes, it is. It's actually based on an RICS calculation, which is based on the working rule agreement. And that includes the normal rate of working, but also includes holiday pay, insurances, health and safety training, CSCS card training, travel allowances, pension. All of these things are included in that £20.70, and you need to show that, and you need to explain it, how you got it. Give an example. There are plenty in my notes. I say that because it is a definitive criteria. Pass rate there, I think it's P7, I think, off the top of my head, but it's in Learning Outcome 3 or Learning Outcome 4 there, okay? I say it because it's a definitive, how do you establish a labour rate? I think it could be P5 actually. So make sure that you include something on that. If you don't and your work is really good, I will ask you some questions and do a quick professional discussion. But I don't really want to be doing that. I want you to include that in your report, okay? Then there's another bit in LO4 more, but there's parts of LO3 in it, so it's in the merit and the distinction bits. Differences in the tender bids. It's also a pass criteria as well, but they all sort of go together. So I don't want you to separate it out. I want you to sort of write it all together. Differences in tender. Why tender bids differ so widely sometimes, basically because it's a commercial decision. All that analytical stuff that we do is based down usually by an educated guess by somebody who's got a lot of experience. Okay, so there's a question in that it suddenly goes from being very scientific and analytical to being a pseudoscience. Okay, because you're starting to go into metaphysics then in many respects to if I bring a bit of philosophy into it. Okay, but that metaphysics is based on something substantive, by the way. All right, and that's commercial risk and how much commercial risk you're willing to take. And that depends on market conditions. It depends on the contract. It depends on your subcontractors and whether there's named subcontractors, domestic subcontractors, preferred subcontractors, nominated suppliers. If there's a lot of preferred subcontractors and nominated suppliers, then there's a higher degree of risk. Okay. Overheads. How much overheads do you, general overheads, not site overheads, that's preliminaries. You've already done that in the preliminary part of the bill of quantities. But your general overheads, as I said to you, that's your marketing, your advertising, your heating bills for your office staff that support you, your account staff, all of these things have to be paid for. And you put it as a percentage in your tender submission. And some people have got higher overheads than others. National contractors will have much higher overheads than say regional or local contractors. So, and you might have a certain way of approaching a tender. You might be more risk averse. Okay, there might be a need for you to be riskier in this particular case. So again, that's in a previous PowerPoint and video that I did. Okay, forgive all the crying in the background. My son is not very happy at the moment, so he's tired, and we came back from London last night and he's very tired, so it was him knocking on my door. Another part of learning outcome 4, again, merits and distinctions. The difference in the initial budgets, the things that you produce in NRM1 and the final estimate that you've produced, that the contractor produced and makes a bid for, or the subcontractor. So you've got to link this back to LO1 and the rules of measurement. Okay, and it depends on, obviously, the initial budgets are based upon information that you've got at a particular moment in time along the project life cycle, and that's where the project life cycle and the RIBA plan of works now starts to come into its own. And if you're using NRM1 techniques for quantification to produce a cost estimate, elemental cost plan with EUR, approximate quantities, then you tend to be relying on historical data. Similar buildings to the one in the case study, a community centre. So you'll look for other community centres that have been built in the past to give you guidance, So you'll look for an elemental cost plan on a community centre that was sort of built previously, and you might make some slight adjustments, or you just might follow it. Yeah. And that historical data can be found these days on the internet, to be honest with you, but it can be Spons is a good example. BCI database now but it costs lots of money. Brilliant for that kind of thing. And then it also tells you in the historical data will also help you determine any adjustments you need to make for inflation, for tender price submission, building price indexes, the location. It's more expensive to build in London than it is in the north of England. So you have to make adjustments for that. Risk factors, because it'll tell you what risk factors. In the NRM1, it tells you what risk factors you need to take into consideration. And it'll tell you how to work out those risk factors. So it's quantifying it for you, but at the same time, it's allowing you to produce a budgetary estimate. The only trouble is, it's based on predominantly historical data and educated guesses, okay? Where the NRM2, NRM3 CESMM, yes, you need a degree, CESMM 3 or 4, you need a degree of professional guesswork. You've done that yourselves with regards to the takeoff. I've deliberately done that, by the way, okay? But the way they're written, what they expect from you is a much, much more analytical breakdown. Breaking everything down into chunks, into meters squared, meters, linear meters, tons, meters cubed, number. From that, you can break everything down into smaller chunks. The labour, plant, and material requirements for this particular component. Let's break it down right down into components there. A brick wall, a raft foundation, some steel. Okay, so you're going to use more up-to-date information. You're going to use quotations from material suppliers or subcontractors which are up-to-date, because they're going to be sent to you that day, a week later after you sending out the information. All right, you can subject that if you want to net present values as well. So if you've got, say, it's a big contract over 5 years, costs are going to fluctuate. You can look at net present values, carry out a net present value exercise. You've got much, much more accurate data. So you can make accurate predictions of what the marketplace is going to look like in 5 years' time. Okay, what you're doing there is reducing your risk. So you're carrying out some financial risk management techniques. Okay, so you can explain all of that, and the questions you need to ask yourself is, to get that higher grade, why do they vary? Why is there a variation between all the different budgets and the final bid for the estimate? How accurate are they? Are they really that accurate? Because, studies suggest, but you have to reinforce this. So if you're going to use a study, reinforce it with a reference. So if you say, for instance, look, if you said something like Latham says that 25% of all construction projects are over budget by 30%, under budget by 30%, and come in 30% higher than what they were originally estimated for, that's a figure that was created in 1995 or 1996 or in the mid-90s. I can't remember now when the Latham report came out, or the Egan report for that matter. These are old reports. Don't use Egan and Latham. Use a much, much more up-to-date report. So if you're going to say, for instance, look, things are a little bit more accurate, but they're still more accurate, and these are the reasons why. And you might want to have a look at some of the RICS publications, some of the free RICS publications to reinforce that. Okay, don't forget to reference it. Don't forget the bibliography. And then you can take it a step further if you want to, and you can say, well, look, will Industry 4.0, I'm using Industry because I teach Industry 4.0 these days. For the manufacturing industry, I teach value engineering, which is a big part of Industry 4.0. Well, Industry 4.0 is also Construction 4.0, which is you're using BIM, digital twins, which is basically what BIM is, robotics, that kind of thing. Okay? Will those types of technologies enable us to make much, much more accurate predictions in the future? Will AI? Certainly AI can, I think, especially some of the stuff that we're using now. So will there be less variations and less difference between the initial budgets. But again, I would say yes, but I would have to reinforce that argument with some background reading, and it's got to be up to date, not bloody Egan. Sorry, not Egan or Latham. Egan and Latham, great, they're starting points. But now, if you say the mid-90s, we'll take 1995 for instance. We're 30 years on now, and there's lots and lots of information out there with regards to this, and certainly BIM, digital twins, the use of MMC, modern methods of construction, factory sort of construction processes now, are certainly helping us to reduce the differences with the initial budgets and the final estimates. So look, if you're looking for a distinction answer, that's going way above the distinction answer, but that's the sort of thing that you could bring in. There's studies out there, there's loads out there. I'm a bit wary of them because they're a bit propagandist, but there's a degree of truth in them. MMC reduces, modern methods of construction reduces costs. Simple. Reduces health and safety issues, risks. Reduces what's the other thing? Time. There's one out there that suggests that it'll reduce your cost by 65%. I'm a little bit in awe of that one. I don't know, but you can make your argument there. In the future, it is better than when Latham and Egan were talking. So you can bring Egan and Latham in, but you have to then temper it by the the technological advances since 1995, 1996. Yeah. So be careful. But that's what we're talking about there, and that's what you need to include there for the higher level there, okay? And then obviously that's all you need to do at the end then, draw in all those responses into a brief conclusion, a couple of 100 words, and make some recommendations in relation to the case study. That's all. That's what I'm looking for. So if I just think about what I saw